inquiry in the meantime from Advocate Fake whether he able to assist in that process. No, it's an impossible task, but I need to make sure that I have.
Is it Celia?
Celia, I think it's happening.
Okay, Fanny Celia, yes. If you could approach him and find out whether it's only in respect of Mr. or Sergeant Rodriguez.
Yes, I'll contact him.
Yes. Similarly, Mr. Vani, I know Advocate Bezos is in court, but would you, on my behalf, approach and find out whether he will be in a position to assist with that reconstruction, if need be. I don't know if they still have the notes. We are talking about a 45-year-old situation here. And also I want to know, Mr. Thompson, on your instructions, first, you need to fashion your relief in such a way that we all understand what is it that you want. In other words, you may want to write down the motion, and so that we're clear about the relief that you are seeking. We shouldn't just go on a speculation. And secondly, consult your client, get instructions as to how the reconstruction is supposed to take place when the magistrate has already passed on. I want you to address me on that tomorrow. Thank you. Yeah, fine. Then with that out of the way, then I think we can proceed.
Before we start, you raised a question in terms of availability of time and witnesses that are coming up tomorrow.
Yes.
I have consulted with some of my colleagues, although not with all of them. But the consensus so far is that we should commence with tomorrow's witnesses and attempt to finish them. And we think we can finish them at least during the course of the afternoon. And then commence the application by my learned friend, Mr. Thompson. And if we don't finish on Thursday afternoon, we then complete it on Friday morning.
Friday morning witness, more or less, how long is it going to take?
We don't think that Mr. Moodley will take that long. We're hoping to submit his report perhaps even before we adjourn today. He's just going to testify on the aspects relating to trajectory. So it's quite a discrete topic. I think we could be done with him in about an hour. We are attempting to get the two witnesses who were on the road outside and who heard the thud. We're not sure whether we can get them for tomorrow morning. The one is under subpoena, and we assume that he won't be available tomorrow. If Mr. Tokanali is available, we think that he's got very short evidence to give, and we think he could be done perhaps in about half an hour.
Yeah, I'm trying to manage, the program here. Some of the witnesses, could come in next week. So far, we have an indication that only 2 police officers may have to testify next week. And beyond that, I don't know whether we have other witnesses to come. In other words, I'm trying not to load the next 2 days because we have to make way for argument on this issue that has been raised. And depending on what is being said here, I'm not sure whether I'll also be able to give an immediate ruling on it. So I'm trying to look at that situation, that we should all try to work within the short period we have.
Yes, we certainly must dispose of the application to be brought on behalf of Mr. Rodriguez, because, as you say, he's meant to testify on
next week.
Monday.
Yes. That's why I'm trying to avoid us loading witnesses tomorrow and Friday.
Right. Well, we'll have those witnesses on standby, and if we have to push them into next week, then so be it.
That would be the preferred option, to make way for this. In other words, how many witnesses we have tomorrow? 2.
Tomorrow we have Mr. Dutton, we have Mr. Foster, and I think that's it. So just two witnesses. Without the application, we would easily finish tomorrow, maybe quite early. But
Then let's keep it that way. Only those 2 tomorrow, so that we deal with the application as well.
Right.
It may well be that I will need some time to reflect on it before I make a ruling.
Right.
So let's keep it that way. Only those 2. Any other witnesses, then you can shift them to next week.
Okay. And Your Lordship, would you like to hear that application first thing tomorrow?
No. The time is not so important. I can hear it at the end. If we can deal with the witnesses first so that we excuse them. And then I don't know how long the debate is going to be, so we can deal with it last, as you have discussed with your colleagues. I'm amenable to that. It's just that I want it to be dealt with tomorrow.
Yes.
That's why I'm giving you the heads up in terms of these directives.
As the court pleases.
Yes. Okay, then let's proceed.
Your Lordship, our next witness is Dr. Steve Naidoo. Who may approach the stand.
Your full name and surname?
My name is Segaran Ramalu Naidoo. I'll spell it out. Segaran Ramalu Ramalu and Naidoo Naidoo.
In objection in taking the oath,
No.
do you swear that the evidence that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. You may sit down. If you prefer to stand, it's okay. But
I would prefer to stand. Thank you.
okay, no. Anytime you feel tired, you may sit down.
Thank you.
Okay, yes.
Doctor, firstly, thanks again for taking time out of your hectic schedule to be with us, and also thank you for travelling up from Durban to be with us. We're very grateful. Doctor, you've supplied us with a curriculum vitae, which is updated until 2016. Your Lordship, this is been handed up as Exhibit C6. Dr. Naidoo, we don't want you to take us through your entire CV, and in fact you have provided us with a helpful summary, and that's actually an addendum to your report at page 15.
Yes. That's right.
Your Lordship, the report is Exhibit C3. Could you advise the court what your qualifications are?
Yeah. I am a specialist forensic pathologist and have been this year, mid-year, for 34 years. I'm registered as such with the Counsel, the Health Professions Council, as a specialist. And of the 34 years of practice, I have been academic head, mainly an academic throughout my career, and for 8 years as Professor of Forensic Medicine at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. But for the last 5 years, forgive me, for the last 5 years I've been in independent or private practice.
I picked up from your CV that you were an honorary research fellow at the School of Law at UKZN up until January 2016.
That's correct.
For us lawyers, what did you do as an honorary research fellow?
Yes, I have written a few articles and in different journals on gunshot wounds, trauma in just about any kind or characteristic or context. And I've also and up to now still are the coordinator of the LLM postgraduate module for law students, largely law students, where we teach the forensic medicine. So I steered that through the School of Law at UKZN at the moment. Continue writing and publishing. I've just been notified today that the latest edition is an editing of a book for East Africa, a forensic medicine manual. It's just been notified. I've just been notified today that it's been published and ready. Yes, and do a lot of consulting.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, were you asked by representatives of the Timol family to prepare a report for this inquest titled Independent Medico-Legal Opinion?
Yes.
Case Death of Ahmed Timol, 27 October 1971. The report is dated 24 July 2017.
That's correct.
You confirm that this is your report?
This is my report.
And you have a copy with you?
Yes, I do.
Your Lordship, the report is marked C3.
Yes.
And Dr. Naidoo, in preparing this report, did you consult certain sources of information, certain documents? If so, can you tell us which documents you consulted?
Yes, there are a number of sources that I looked at, but those that I referenced for this opinion in footnoting are two textbooks, one by Bernard Knight, which is a classic textbook for undergraduates and postgraduates in the English-speaking world, and there's another book on forensic histopathology, particularly because the transcripts of the original inquest concern to a great deal the histopathology, that is microscopy of tissues, and a few other electronic sources, journal articles that I used.
And did you have access to the original inquest record, as well as any statements and photographs?
Yes, I had and used the original record from, of course, page 653 onwards, and particularly in that, the testimonies of the pathologists that were concerned at the original inquest.
That would be Dr. Skeepers, Glapnum, and Koch.
Koch, that's correct. I also, in the bundle, received Dr. Skeepers' report in Afrikaans, so it had to be translated. And I particularly used reference two statements. They are by two policemen, one by the surname of Dazel and the other Rodriguez. And of course, I got a set of 7 photographs. Those, my lord, were the sources of information, the material, primary sources from the original inquest record that I received.
And did you visit John Vorster Square? And if so, where in John Vorster Square did you go?
Yes, yesterday morning at around 8:45 in the morning, I was taken to the ground floor, the bottom portion, or the front of the building at the bottom, where the pavemented area and a little garden, elevated raised garden shrubbery area, and then subsequently went up to the 10th and of course 10th floor, and of course the roof structure.
So the garden area where you advised that approximately was the impact site for Mr. Timol following his fall?
That's correct.
And on the 10th floor, did you visit room 1026?
Particularly room 1026, we saw the general environment, but went into and did an examination at 1026.
Thank you. You mentioned that you arranged for the translation of the post-mortem report of Dr. Skeepers. Can you tell us who did that translation?
It was done at my request by my forensic pathologist colleague, another specialist, by Dr. Karisha Quarry. She is a younger but well-trained forensic pathologist. Her version, a transcript or a translation, I checked through against the original, and I was satisfied that it was probably the best I could receive. And then I edited just the 35 listed injuries, enumerated them just for reference purposes. That's the only amendment that I made.
I see. And Your Lordship, that translation has been handed up marked C4, and it's also attached to Dr. Naidoo's report. Dr. Naidoo, a few more housekeeping matters, if I can refer to them as such. In your report, there's at least one drawing of the garden area with a body located in this picture. And you've also attached annexes B to G, certain diagrams. Can you just explain why it is we have this picture and those diagrams in your report?
Yes. Because diagrams represent a reconstruction, and the visual effect is very is helpful. The wounds themselves were individually depicted onto diagrams. The annexures at the end, B to G, individually enumerated, and also scaled down to size and distribution, and that was important. And that is still, I believe, the best that could be done by myself.
And you did it on the basis of the post-mortem report?
Purely on the basis of the post-mortem report. Wounds numbered 1 to 35. 35 different descriptions were depicted on the diagram. That, I think, is a good representation of the pictorial, of the view of those injuries, particularly since the photographs are somewhat incomplete. Now that deals with annexures B to G, but annexure A, the image drawn, it's a computer-drawn picture, is less valuable because it's only based on the testimony of Daisel, and I think is certainly imprecise. It's probably not completely correct.
Before we go to that evidence, the numbering on your sketches, does it accord with any particular numbering by the Dr. Scapers? Or it's just your own numbering?
The numbering of the wounding?
Of the wounds, yes, as
Yes.
indicated on the sketch.
No, they were exactly according to Dr. Scapers. He bulleted, though, in his post-mortem report, he bulleted them under annexure, he called it annexure 1, and there are 35 bullets. I simply changed that to 35 numbers.
Okay.
Yes.
And just for the sake of completeness, you also were able to inspect certain photographs.
Yes.
You described them as 7 sepia-toned photographs.
Correct.
Doctor, we can now move to...
May I
yes.
May I just draw your attention to the photographs? There are 3 of these photographs, the original sepia-toned ones, that are inverted. In other words, they're mirror imaged. And those would be photographs 1, 6, and 7 are inverted. So 2, 3, and 5, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are correct. So in those mirror image 1, 6, and 7, when you look at something on the right side, it is the left side we're looking at.
Yes.
It's a mirror image.
Thank you for your last task, Doctor. Doctor, we can now turn to a discussion of your findings. Although before we do so, you do point out that you labour under certain limitations, and I think it's appropriate that you point out what those limitations were.
Yes, thank you. Just to my analysis, the limitations were that the biggest limitation is the absence of the great proportion of the original record, but particularly the original reports of the Dr. Gluckman, the independent pathologist, and Professor Koch, the other pathologists from Pretoria. Those, I believe, that were it's significant because I believe that could have cleared up a lot of the uncertainties. Those are the two. There's the first one.
Just a minute, before you pass this point,
yes.
You say which particular reports you did not have?
Yes. Well, of the first 652 pages, my Lord, that are missing, in there, those would be relevant to my needs in doing this analysis would be Dr. Gluckman and Professor Koch's original reports.
Oh, Professor Koch?
Yes.
Oh, okay. But you did get the medical, the post-mortem report by Dr. Square.
That's correct, yes.
Oh,
that's okay. And of course, to complete that, just the fact that a fair amount of the transcript that we have after 653, pages 653 onwards, and that relates to some of the pathologist's testimony was in Afrikaans, and I couldn't get that in time translated. And of course, I felt, of course, that the original autopsy report of Dr. Square was in fact less than adequate and less than comprehensive. And I thought that was a limitation as well.
Doctor, can you take us through the main inadequacies, in your view, of Dr. Square's report?
Thank you, my Lord. The report will, at first glance, first view, will appear comprehensive, will appear detailed, but it does definitely fall short of the comprehensiveness that I believe, and even in 1971, I believe should have accompanied a death of this context, this nature, and this history. In that particularly, well, it's a death in custody. In particularly, the quality of the documentation was inadequate. The descriptions of wounds were inadequate. Lack of measurements, with the exception of one of those 35 pointed numbered wounds, only one had a measurement, the rest do not. We have no idea of the depth, the extent deeply, and also the description, the qualitative description, for example, of fine nuances like color changes and variances, patterns, etc. These weren't there. And the same applies to the internal injuries and the pathology. I was, to be honest, disappointed that I wasn't able to glean the information that I needed to make the inferences that we need to make in an objective manner. Then there were no x-rays taken, and certainly I started, although I started my training in 1980, forensic training in 1982, 1983, I believe in 1971, there were x-rays available, and this case should have had x-rays, and I'll explain why it should have had x-rays. Mainly to characterize the nature, for detection, first of all, to detect those injuries that are missing. We don't know about the pelvis. It might have been a very cursory examination of the pelvis that can miss such fractures. And pelvic fractures are important, the nature of the fracture, important to decide whether it was a pre-existing injury not from the fall or from a fall. or the nature of the fall. And of course, then you need an X-ray load to characterize the nature of the fracture, differentiate, for example, what they call a dislocation of the left ankle, whether it was an inversion, an inwardly diverted displacement fracture or eversion, or a telescoping compression that would give us an idea whether he fell on a foot or on the feet, or whether it was an antemortem injury. And then, of course, I believe that critically important were the lack of photography. It ties up with the others. Lack of adequate photography, sorry. In other words, I would have wanted to see the exact depiction of that skull fracture to decide whether it's a fracture of such an impact of 10 floors, or whether it's a fracture caused by another kind of infliction of force, blunt force, directed force. I would wanted to know whether, for example, fracture patterns, they betray a lot. Fracture patterns could betray nature of injury, direction of injury, and help quantify the amount of force. Then, of course, there were no no toxicological analysis, and it's almost like a minimum standard now that we have, that in a fresh death like this, where there's minimal or no survival, that you must do routine toxicological analysis. Even though they might have had challenges in early 1970s, they should have at least done basic screening, toxicological screen, and an alcohol level, which we would consider the very minimum. And finally, the other shortcoming, forgive me, it's a bit dry, shortcoming is that there was, I felt, a lack of anticipation of what I believe would be the lines of medical legal inquiry. An experienced pathologist should be aware. This is a custody death, this is a context, this is a history, and these are the questions that should be asked, that will be asked. Thank you very much. And that the investigation routes should have been guided by the anticipation of those lines of inquiry. For example, toxicological analysis, great detailed descriptions and reconstructions of the injury patterns in that case would have told us quite a lot.
Doctor, the one aspect I think you omitted was that the skull fractures were not drawn onto diagrams.
Correct.
Is that also a shortcoming?
That's correct, yes. And diagrams or sketches. Anatomically correct sketches.
Thank you, Doctor. All right, Doctor, let's now turn to your discussion. And I see you commence with a discussion about the value of the histological examination of wounds to determine their age. Yes. You seem to be saying that they're of limited value. Could you explain?
Yes, in context. I'll summarize that very quickly because mainly the greater portion of the available transcript of the oral proceedings involving the three pathologists involved the understanding of the histological appearance of the wounds, such as what you see on microscopy, to try to determine the age. I think 95% or more of the transcript dealt with that. I don't know, obviously, what was in the original portion of the transcript. Maybe there was a lot there that could help the balance. But I felt that the emphasis on the histology was misplaced, was a bit misdirected. And the reason for this is that in the 70s, or much before, the value of histology, that's looking at tissues under the microscope, was well understood, well recognized. And there was a lot known already about the appearances of wounds of different ages. And the science has advanced tremendously. That's still very good science, or shall we say excellent science, advanced tremendously now that we can, besides general histology, we can do what we call immunological investigations into histology. Tell you a tremendous amount. I won't want to go into detail. But what we must understand, it applied then, and it also applies now, is that for a court, for concrete, objective, solid evidence in court, that the histological features are very good at showing the difference between ante-mortem and post-mortem or peri-mortem wounds. That we can accept. But if you're going to look at the histology and the special investigations in trying to distinguish between, is this 3 or 4 or 5 days, or is it 6 or 7 or 8 days, then that is displaced. Because even today we recognize the biological variations that occur in tissue are so wide that you cannot use this to make that distinction, oh, it's 3 days and not 4 days, or 4.5 and not 7 days. I don't want to go into detail, but the accumulation of error would be so hazardous that it would be inadvisable for court to place reliance upon this. So, to summarize, the histology, putting it very simply, is good because it did help there just to decide and to determine that all those surface, or the greater number of the surface bruises and abrasions were healing wounds. And it had been there at least for several days. That is the limit to which we can, as scientists, forensic specialists, can say with confidence.
Is there a possibility, just a minute, as a follow-up to what you've just said now,
Yes.
with modern science having advanced to where we are now, 2017,
Yes.
is there a way in which, let's put aside the question of Mr. Timol, assuming a death were to occur now,
Yes.
how accurate would it be for any pathologist to determine the exact time of a particular wound?
Yes.
Is there are there any factors that could be taken into account to do that?
Yes, my lord. What it does is it gives you good evidence, but we only express it to be safe in terms of a range. That is, there are 2 wounds. If there are 2 wounds, one is likely to be between 3 and 7 days, while another is between 1.5 and 2 weeks, or 10 to 14 days. So that sort of comparative evidence statement is valid in the order of weeks.
Is it any
But
different to what they did in 1971?
My concern is that what they were trying to do was differentiate in the order of days. That is this a wound that is between 4 and 7 days, or is this a wound between 4 and 12 days? And that was what, 4 and 5 days, and 4 and 12 days. I can't remember the exact detail, but that's what they were trying to do. That level of hazard now was, we would consider, is probably unacceptable.
In regard to the range?
That's correct. To conclude, for the court to make a finding that because Mr. Timol had been in custody for 4.5 days, or just almost 5 days, that the particular wound we can conclude is 6 days old. Therefore, the wounds that we see antedated the arrest, and that is dangerous.
So no reliance can be placed even on that estimate?
Well, it's a qualified reliance. Let's assume we have a child with 2 lesions, one on this shoulder and one on the other shoulder, left and right. It's important because repetitive injuries of different ages are important to diagnose repetitive child abuse. If we use that, and I use this as an analogy to say that this is a wound 3 to 5 days old, and this is a wound 8 to 9 days old, is we can say that confidently, then that is good evidence for a court to make a finding of repetitive child abuse. A good possibility of repetitive child abuse. But using the same or similar sort of differences in wound age to make a finding as to whether injuries occurred pre-custody or in custody would be hazardous if you are looking at the differences in the order of days.
Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Naidoo, just so we're clear, what do you understand between ante-mortem and peri-mortem?
Yes, so, thank you. I may have used the word post-mortem too frequently. It's just a common habit. Ante-mortem is definitely ante-mortem, that which had occurred before death. Post-mortem, definitely after death. There is just about that time of death, just before and just after, talking about a few hours, where we cannot say, and we call that stage peri-mortem.
Thanks for that clarification. All right, so we can now turn to your report where you commence with setting out the fall-related injuries. That's at paragraph 11, page 6 of your report.
Thanks.
Can you commence now by taking us through the fall-related injuries?
Thanks, and I read from paragraph 11 of my report. I believe the fall-related injuries would most likely have been those that occurred as a result of that major, heavy, broad, gravitational impact of 60 kilograms. And that will include the bruise seen on the left side of the forehead, associated with the fracture line of the forehead that ran backward and downwards through the base of skull. So through the sphere, through the entire vault or cranial compartment. It was an encircling fracture that ran.
And sorry to interrupt you, Doctor, but if you wish to refer to your diagrams, feel free to do so.
Oh, thank you. It is an extra F at the end, F, which shows us 6 skull diagrams. You can see the fracture running, and I've depicted it. I've depicted it in the best way possible, exactly from the report. So, but I do accept that there may be slight differences in the way the fracture would originally have been. So
that's on page 31 of your report.
On page 31 of the report. Thank you. The fracture then, which ran, I want to maybe just describe the fracture, ran again across to the midline. There was another fracture running down on the right side. It ran down, both of them ran down to the base. They crossed over the base, almost to the effect that you could imagine the entire right side front of the skull could have been mobile and loose, because the fracture ran encircled the skull, well, almost encircled the skull. In addition, the fracture of the base also could be seen, in my opinion, could be seen running down the orbito-nasal portions. So in other words, leaving this portion of the nose as a loose, mobile area of the nose. And of course ran down the right side of the upper jaw. That would be, I think, the basal fracture. In addition, that's fall related. While we're here, though, the fracture of the left angle of the mandible, corner of the mandible, which was described as fragmented, broken into pieces. I find that hard to reconcile because when I look at this fracture, I am seeing the pattern fracture of a massive impact and probably over the front of the head, that fractured skull in that manner. It's what we call the struck hoof phenomenon. If you look at a ball, Your Worship, a ball that is struck on impact, it deforms like a struck hoof in a split second, and because of the deformity, it fractures right through. So the fracture of the left side of the jaw, left angle of the jaw, cannot reconcile easily. The one thing is, when the body strikes the ground, it doesn't go bouncing like a football. It may have a secondary impact of another part, but then it does not go bouncing. So I find it hard to reconcile this fracture because it's a separate impact. And then, of course, the skull, what is described in the left parietal area of the skull, and I'm pointing to the left parietal, the left side of the crown, there's another depressed fracture, which I also cannot reconcile because it is almost unheard of to have the body bouncing on the ground. Remember, it's a 10-meter fall. It's not a fall from a parachute jump with us lots of time to reorientate the body.
You mean 10 floors, 10 stories?
Sorry, 10 floors, 10 floors, probably about 30 or more meters. And to get a separate impact on the side opposite the side of impact is also incongruous. It's inconsonant findings. Let's go back to the other fall, what I believe are fall-related injuries. The brain injury, and I referred to diagram G on a single of those 6 diagrams. I've got the injury described on the brain, that is the tear of the underside of the left frontal lobe, as well as hemorrhage in that area, basal, left frontal, and temporal lobe. So in other words, in this side, it's a base on this side of the brain. And that would be fall related because that's where the fracture ran. Okay. Then the fractured cervical spine. To fracture the cervical spine needs considerable high intensity and high magnitude force that either knocks the neck backwards, or knocks the neck forwards, or compresses, telescopes of the neck spine. And in this way, I cannot determine whether the head was knocked backward or forward to cause a fracture of the low 7th cervical vertebra. I would think, though, with the frontal impact, it would have to be an hyperextension rather than a hyperflexion kind of impact that fractured the 7th vertebra. And here, X-rays, of course, would have helped. Most of the fractured ribs, we know that high fall, and we talk about very high falls, are over 30 meters. So I think this fall will be in the category of very high fall. Between 7 and 30, it's what we call normal high falls. Under 7 meters, what we call low falls. So in high falls, you get fractures of the rib, usually in multiple positions and involving most of the ribs. And in the fractures of these ribs, which is largely at the right sides, so the impact would be generally from the front and the side, and it transmits to the other side in that impact. If you, what I'm saying is, impact at one side is transmitted to the other side, fracturing the ribs because they deform. The other fracture that would be, the other injury fall related would be the fracture of the right elbow.
Just one question for clarification. Could you say most of the fractured ribs you don't exclude the possibility that one or other rib might have been a pre-fall injury?
Might not have been a pre-fall. Yes, that's right. I can't exclude that. I think most of the fractured ribs...
Or rather, to be clear, might have been a pre-fall.
Oh, pre-fall, yes, pre-fall. Yes. I thought it... Sorry, I heard free-fall. Yes, some of those ribs I cannot exclude being pre-fall injuries.
Thank you.
Then also the lacerations of the lungs, typical. The lungs lacerate mainly because of pressure changes, not mainly because of rib fractures themselves that puncture the lungs, but also pressure changes that tear the lung lobes to an extent. Then lacerations of the liver, characteristic and typical of falls. The laceration that was described of the right side, deep fissuring lacerations, but strangely hardly any blood around the abdomen, which I would expect. That is typically fall-related. Then there's contusion within the heart valve ring. That's I can't remember which valve. It's mitral valve ring. Get a deep-seated contusion. It wouldn't be a superficial, low impact. It will be a deep, resounding, reverberating impact in the chest that causes that sort of contusion. Similarly to the torn renal artery, what happens at the heavy impact, the kidney, which is sort of a weighty, relatively weighty organ attached by a little ligament or pedicle of an artery and a vein, it sort of pulls away and it tears. That's also typical fall-related. Okay. Fractured right elbow, I mentioned, because the fractured elbow also suggested that it was a right-sided impact, or a right front-sided impact, rather than left side. And the one thing is, I cannot characterize the fractured femur. The fractured femur can occur as a result of many things. It could occur as a result of the fall, if, as I believe, Lord, that the body fell, the first impact, or the primary impact, was a head, shoulder, right side, right elbow, and right chest. But the second part, the lower part of the body, might have also struck as a secondary impact to fracture the femur.
Thank you, Doctor. We can now move to what is of great interest to us, and that are the injuries, in your view, are not fall-related. And this is also on page 6 of your report. You have made passing reference to some of those injuries, but if you could please take us through the non-fall-related injuries in your considered view.
Thank you, Richard, my Lord. The 35 injuries listed by Dr. Skeepers in his bulleted form are in Annexure 1 on page 19 of my report, in the translated report. Wounds 1 to 7, we can agree are all fall-related. Fractured left elbow, mid-shaft right femur, contusions of the forehead. Well, I can't say that the contusions of the forehead are definitely fall-related, but they are in the region where the fracture was. So 1 to 10, the Lord, is fall-related, but 8 to 35, which are multiple, discrete, or what we call multifocal injuries. In their individual, small, discrete, separate from each other, not confluent. And depicted on the diagram, they have some characteristic positions of being in recesses and not buttresses. In other words, those portions of the body surface that are hard to get in a fall, such as in the region, the protected region under the armpit, in the recessed, sunken area of the neck under the jaw, areas where a fall won't cause injuries. So, and these 8 to 35, wounds number 8 to 35, are what were largely used to do the histological examination of all the abrasions and bruises, and which were agreed by all the pathologists, even though they differed on the age somewhat, they did agree that all of them were healing wounds. And those were not fall related. May I continue?
Yes, please.
Still on those wounds of non-fall related ones, I believe that they're not, like was suggested in the original inquest, brushing against the wall, falling against the corner. I believe they were caused by multiple applications of force. Whether they were during carrying of a body, or whether they were direct application force is unclear. Although it would be very hard for a pathologist to accept that a young male, generally young male, not got lots of subcutaneous tissue, will bruise easily on carrying or grabbing. We don't usually bruise that easily, a young male.
In your report, you refer to varied and multiple blunt force impacts.
That's correct.
Paragraph 14.
That's correct, yes. It's not clear from the autopsy how deep these injuries were, like these bruises, except for what Dr. Skeepers described. And for example, he described, and I'd ask you to rather look at the diagrams, number 19 on diagram C. And I depicted the contusion, the bruise over the calf. It is about the only position where Dr. Skeepers describes contusion of the muscle. So what he must have seen, if he didn't make an incision, and we don't know if he did, it wasn't put to him, we don't know whether it, in the missing pages of the inquest, it was put to him, and whether he conceded that he'd seen this bruising of the muscle only through the surface, or he made an incision, we have no idea. But it's considerable bruising. So we don't know how deep these other surface injuries were. All we can go is a judgment on the photographs and judgment made by someone with care and experience. All I can suggest is that they're forensically relevant in that you make deductions from them, such as I mentioned, wounds that are on recesses. They're multifocal, circumscribed, right all over the body, on the front, rear, sides of the body. So that just won't occur as a result of single impact. And neither would wounds in recesses and hidden spots be occasioned just by a person rolling over, for example, in pain with an abdominal complaint or being hurt.
All right, well, you're currently watching the inquest into the death of Ahmed Timol taking place there at the North Gauteng High Court. We're going to take a little quick breather and we're back on top of the hour with more news, and definitely we're going to take you back to those live proceedings in the Pretoria High Court. Stay with us. This is SABC News.
In terms of the description in the post-mortem report, these particular injuries are far too extensively bruised to have been secondary to the impact of falling to the ground. If that is the case, then what could have caused such an injury?
Yes. I make specific mention because here I talk about that incongruity of the detail, the inconsistency. And I'm coming further to deciding or giving a suggestion as to how long this patient should survive. I believe that from the secondary features of the fall-related injuries, I believe he was alive, but alive for a very short period. There's minimal blood around the lungs, and these lungs have quite a few tears, especially on the right side. There is no blood described around the liver. And I'd be very, very surprised, because that's the greatest source of bleeding, a ruptured liver like that. So, and this minimal degree, if we go by Dr. Skeper's description, there's minimal bruising, minimal reactionary hemorrhage, although there is, because, for example, around the torn renal artery, there's a little bit of hemorrhage. And all that tells you that there is a suggestion that he was alive, but for a very short period of time. And therefore, my Lord, when you look at the left ankle fracture, dislocation, which I believe, and I'll explain why I believe that there almost certainly was a fracture as well. And I look at the right calf contusion. It's so inconsistent in terms of time that my only reasonable conclusion is that they had occurred not from the fall, but before the fall. That he was there before the fall. The fall caused him to survive not more, in my opinion, than 10 minutes. In fact, I think it's even less, maybe 5 minutes.
And Doctor, to come back to my question, what could have caused the observed injury to the lower right calf, which has been described as, or you've described as extensive bruising?
Yes. The lower right calf, will just deal with that. The only thing I can think of, it's not an orthopedic injury, it's a muscular injury, my Lord. It's going to have to be from blunt impact. Blunt impact that didn't cause a limb to go into deformity and fracture, but blunt impact directed at the calf. It's my only first conclusion.
Could an instrument have been used to deliver that injury?
Most likely by an instrument.
And what kind of instrument?
It's got to be a heavy instrument. Either an instrument that's a heavy instrument used to inflict the injury, or it could be by, of course, blows such as kicking and blows to the calf.
Is it conceivable or possible that an iron rod could have been used to deliver such an injury?
Very likely.
All right. If we could perhaps move to your paragraph 17, where you provide a discussion of the depressed fracture of the left parietal bone.
Yes.
Now, when we looked at the diagrams of the skull, you indicated to the court that because of the fracture pattern, this is more likely to be an isolated impact that is distinct from the fall.
Correct. Putting it another way, unless there's something that we don't know in history, this doesn't fit with the fall.
Right. So I have a few questions arising, and the first one is, again, how could this injury have come about if it wasn't from the fall?
Well, that's a good question, my Lord, because here is the importance of distinguishing between the high velocity impact with the shearing deformity type injury and local application of force. So if you have a local application of force with an object like this, it will simply cause a local depressed fracture. But if it on the skull, that's what we call focal or local injury. But you take the same skull and take, like a football, and throw it against the wall, the skull deforms. You can't see it deform, so split second, and causes that extensive eggshell-like fracture. That's the difference between the high velocity mobile force injury and then a fixed, somewhat fixed skull sustaining an impact.
And Dr. Naidoo, would I be correct in saying that you've endeavoured to graphically display the location of this particular injury in your Annex F, in the diagram at the bottom left hand of the page?
Yes. Yes. Annexure F, the bottom left diagram. I've depicted it because nothing to base the appearance on. I depicted it very neatly as a depressed fracture. It's a little depression. It could be slightly varied. Bottom line is that it's a depressed fracture, and a depressed fracture is, as I mentioned, localized application of force.
Somebody receiving such an injury, what would be the impact on such a person?
Very severe. If he doesn't, generally localized depressed fracture, they won't die immediately, but there's a high risk of internal bruising of the brain, which you call contusion, and hemorrhage, and then rapidly development of the hemorrhage as it continues to bleed, and the bruised brain swelling, and then of course this is a classic head injury. This is a kind of patient that is rushed into neurosurgery to elevate the fracture and drain out the blood to relieve the pressure, because of course pressure is the most serious complication in head injury. That's what damaged the brain. So this patient then receiving such an impact won't die immediately, but in all probability would be unconscious or in semi-coma or coma.
I see. I want to turn to the level of consciousness in a moment. But just to confirm that in your view, if such an injury is not treated, there's a high probability of death.
Yes.
Are you able to say approximately in what period of time?
Not being clinicians, difficult, but patient depressed fracture is not treated, is definitely, that brain's going to swell with the accumulation of blood and within a few days, but it'll take a few days to die.
Thank you. So you've testified that in all likelihood, following this blow, Mr. Timol was rendered unconscious?
If that blow was sustained before the fall, yes, it will rendered him unconscious, definitely.
And it is your view that this particular injury is a pre-fall injury?
Well, my conclusion is that it doesn't fit the fall pattern. So because of that, it's more than likely pre-fall.
In terms of the consciousness of Mr. Timol, is it possible that he might have fallen unconscious for a considerable period of time? Or could he perhaps have been slipping in and out of consciousness?
Oh, they do. They do slip in and out of consciousness. It will be a clinical opinion, but I know that it's not definite that he would be unconscious, but he would certainly have a depressed level of consciousness, and quite possibly, in non-expert opinion, be slipping in and out of consciousness.
So, what would the general impact of such an injury be on Mr. Timol, in particular his cognitive ability and his ability to be mobile?
It rendered him, because of his state of unconsciousness, rendered him immediate incapacity in terms of maybe in a state of delirium and delirious speech, are not able to engage in conversation or respond. He might just be able to respond by groans if he had this serious head injury, but certainly not be able to walk or sit up, etc.
In paragraph 18, you make reference to an injury that you have drawn our attention to, and that is the fracturing of the lower jaw. And you say that at its corner, it appears fragmented, and in brackets you put broken into pieces. So it certainly looks like a serious injury. Again, how would such an injury be caused if it was not fall related?
it would have been caused by a direct application of force to the left angle of jaw and that side of the neck.
Would it be a blunt force?
A blunt force, yes, a blunt force.
And the impact of such an injury, would such a person be able to carry on talking? Would such a person perhaps drink coffee?
I certainly don't think so. That would be, if that was an injury alone without any other injuries, that would be a terribly debilitating injury. To fragment the jaw, you might have been bleeding from the mouth because there could be lacerations and open wounds inside the mouth with maybe broken teeth. He certainly wouldn't have been able to carry on a normal conversation, let alone drink a cup of coffee. Can I draw your attention to 19? So
Yes, of course.
19 is something that I didn't depict on a diagram or anything. Is 19 on page 8, the deep scalp bruising of the left occipital area. The left occipital area is at the left back of the head, and I'm pointing at in the court to the low back of the head. Now that too is not, that's discrete and separate from the fracture, depressed fracture of the left parietal area, and this too cannot be explained by the fall.
But again, it can potentially be explained by a severe blunt blow to that area.
That's correct.
Dr. Naidoo, I'm going to move to your view on how the body landed, but before I do, are there any other particular injuries you wish to draw attention to in relation to non-fall injuries?
No, I think that covered most of them.
Can you indicate to the court how you believe Mr. Timol landed in that garden?
Yes, just as I mentioned earlier, the impact sites were the frontal region of the face, possibly the impact sites, frontal region of the face, not the face, sorry, the head, not the face. Okay, head, a right elbow and chest region. Largely, that is the primary impact site. The right femoral fracture can be caused as secondary impact because once the body lands on this region firstly, then the rest of the body bounces also to the ground, and he can fracture the femur, but that's a possibility, and I can't exclude that.
And the doctors who examined the body are not in a position to say which was the primary impact area.
I think if I do recall reading that portion of the transcript that is in English, they did concede it was a fracture of the right side of the, they mentioned fracture at the right side of the chest, impact at the right side of the chest. Lord.
You got this from the transcript?
From the transcript, yes. If my recall is correct, and I'm confident of that. Yes, that dealt with the impact of the body. I think I need to add, as a negative, that my impressions is that he didn't fall on his feet, either on one foot or two, because the pattern of injuries, I think, would be quite different. Despite the injury of the left ankle, that's a fracture dislocation, and the bruising of the right side, I believe that's not the point of impact, that it occurred not related to the fall.
Thank you, Doctor. And Doctor, your report seems to indicate that you're satisfied that Mr. Timol was alive at the time of the fall.
Yes, I believe, in consideration of all the little findings, it points to Mr. Timol being alive at the time of the fall. Whether he was conscious or not, there's no way I think anyone can say.
But there's a possibility at least that he was unconscious but alive at the time of the fall.
Yes, very much so.
You've already indicated how long you believed he would have been alive for. We don't have to traverse that again.
Yes, sir, but I just need to bring an error in my written report, type report. In number 27, I mentioned, in discussing how long I think he had survived, I mentioned that in number 27, Mr. X enters the room at 15 hours 50 and Dr. Kemp sees the body taken up to the 9th floor. I need to correct that. It's when Dr. Kemp sees the body when it lay in a passage in the 9th floor. This is just an error, and I apologize for that.
Thanks for that clarification. You've also testified on the neck injuries, and so that we won't have to traverse. But you also seem to be excluding the possibility of strangulation.
Yes. Simply, just to very briefly describe, strangulation, usually there's a pattern. Despite it being so hard to believe, but you must see a pattern of application of force. For example, multifocal digital application of fingers or constriction. There are patterns that you see, and that's not the pattern. What I'm seeing here is evidence of superficial strap muscle hemorrhage and tear at the right clavicle that typically occurs as a result of sudden hyperextension backwards. So there's sudden stretching of the muscle fibers in the most superficial layer of the neck, what we call the strap muscles. And that, in fact, supports the contention of that impact over the front of the head, knocking the head backwards.
Thank you. Dr. Naidoo, your report devotes considerable attention to the injury of the left, which is described as a left ankle dislocation.
Yes.
And the heading is before, after the fall.
Yes.
Can you take the court through your conclusions?
Thanks very much. Here again, I bring up that the difference in intensity of description. This is the only place where there are 4 references to the bruising around the left ankle. That's in wound number 31, described bruising at the left lateral aspect of the foot, the left side of the foot. Number 32, which it describes large contusions, bruises over the anterior part of the lower leg near the ankle. And then wound 35, contusion of the posterior part of the left lower leg near the ankle. Now I believe that's significant. There's 3 descriptions of bruising. And that's unusual. And that tells you that's a serious injury to the ankle. And all of us know the Lord is that when you sprain your ankle, we either twist it inside or twist it outside, you get swelling, and we see the swelling within a few hours, it'll be seen. By the next morning, the ankle is nicely swollen. And if there's a bit of a reddish bruising there, we always get an x-ray because swelling will mask a fracture. Invariably, there's a little bit of a crack fracture, usually of the thin fibula on the outside of the right, if I'm using the right leg or left leg, and the outside of the compartment is a thinner fibula that fractures, but it won't be deformed because the thicker tibia keeps the stability of that ankle. But there are other bones that can also fracture. So, summary, my Lord, I believe the fracture was missed simply because they didn't x-ray, or, well, I don't know if they dissected into the ankle. So that is a serious injury, especially if there's visible bruising on a body that was testified to at the previous inquest as being dark-skinned. Visible bruising, then I'm saying there's a high likelihood there's a fracture in that ankle. Now, at the number 33, I go on to say, so this then I believe is too great a vital reaction for someone that survived only for a few minutes. A vital reaction means the reaction of a body to injury. Starts off with immediate hemorrhage, and then swelling, and then the earliest features, exudation of fluid into any injury, be it small or large. Vital reaction is the same, and then it goes on as a person starts to repair and heal, the healing reactions and what we look for under the microscope. But the earliest vital reaction is probably the occurrence of bleeding, and that's what we're seeing in this. And that is not consistent with having occurred in that fall. And therefore, I believe that the left ankle fracture dislocation occurred before the fall. And I draw attention then in reconciling statements to the observations of Salim Issap, who was arrested together with Timol, when he saw a person on the Monday, 25th of October 1971, hooded, those are his words, and then of course stated to be dragged along, in inverted commas, not able to walk normally, and also held up by security officers on either side of him who were holding on to the sides of the trunk. He thought that person was Timol. And I believe then that probably points to pre-existing injuries, especially the left ankle, but also probably of the right calf, if he wasn't able to even ambulate on his own.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, wearing your medical practitioner hat, are you able to express a view on whether the deceased is able to throw himself out the window, either by way of jumping or diving?
Yes, I believe I can, but obviously I speak a lot as an ordinary medical practitioner, an ordinary person, but also as a forensic pathologist, because it's reconciling what the Germans call the capacity to act after injury. How much can you do, how far can you walk, etc. I believe that, I just might, that first of all, would he have been able, by his own doing, to get to that window and throw himself out? I just want to deal with the aperture which I measured, the size, and I approximated Ahmed Timol's size. It was 1.6 meters and 61 kilograms, approximated onto a police officer, lady, that will remain unknown. And she happened to be on scene yesterday. I took the measurements, a shoulder-to-shoulder measurement, aperture measurement, and my impression is, yes, it could have fitted through the aperture. When the window opens, it hinges. There's a big aperture and a small aperture. Certainly, it could have fitted at a squeeze. I did it myself, and I'm taller and a little bigger, even though I'm scrawny. I could have fitted, and so could Salim have fitted through the big aperture. So with a small aperture,
when you say Salim, you mean Mr. Timol?
Oh, sorry. The deceased, Mr. Timol. It could have, a small aperture, certainly couldn't have fitted in the same manner. He's facing upright. He would have had to slide his body, turn his face upward, slide his body, and probably squeeze through. And that I don't think is easy. But having said that, yes, his body could have fitted. Let's look at the other aspects. Ahmed Timol, I'm looking at the paragraph with Salim. Please forgive me for that. Ahmed Timol being 1.6 meters, the windowsill at 96 centimeters above the ground is just above his umbilicus. Now, our normal center of gravity is between the hip bone, so that's just at the level of the pubis, or if a man, just to say, at around just above his scrotum, is his center of gravity. If he were to be approaching at 1.6 meters, he would not be able to fall forward. And that is why when you build banisters and railings, you want the railing to be above the center of gravity. So you can lean forward, but your body doesn't fall over. So he couldn't have fallen over. How then could he have gotten? The heater, the radiator, the old radiator, is 85 centimeters above the ground, the top of it. The valve, I think it's the pressure release valve, whatever valve is there, is 33 centimeters. He would have had to clamber onto either that valve or the top of the heater or onto the ledge himself at 96 centimeters. Okay. 33 centimeters, 85, 96 centimeters, or onto a chair which is approximately 50 centimeters. Okay. To clamber up. Now to clamber up, a normal person doing that will take, before you find yourself in position, fix one leg and lift the other. That would take about 5 seconds. If you look at 5 seconds, it's considered a long time. Okay. Even if you just time it, 5 seconds is a lot. You would have had to clamber up to the ledge to get his feet with. I worked this out to an extent. He could have lifted himself with the arms, okay, if his arms were well. But he still would have had to more likely have levered himself by grabbing the sides of the window aperture. It's very difficult to do that just with the arms. So you have to have the assistance of the lower legs. Now, would this have been possible? And my opinion, not, because I believe at the best scenario that the deceased was desperately ill. He would have hardly been in a position, if he was conscious, that is, to be able to ambulate and walk to the window, or get out of the chair, walk to the window, even place an attempt to achieve that effort of heaving himself out. That's a best case scenario. Okay. He wouldn't have been able to walk unaided with the ankle and calf injuries that I believe are ante-mortem. At the worst case scenario, I believe that he would be in extremis, maybe prostrate or unconscious. So, and of course, if you ask me, would he, rather than heaving himself out the window, would he have been able to dive through? And I think the court will accept that. My opinion would be, if he couldn't achieve getting a little bit of ambulation with that injury, unless assisted, he wouldn't have even been able to dive through the window.
And if he had dived through, you seem to indicate that he might have sustained further injuries.
Yes, what I would look at the aperture and the latch mechanism. It sticks out with a little twirling knob to tighten the hold in the latch. If someone had dived through the aperture, I would have expected his clothes or his body to have snagged onto the edges of the aperture and the upturned little opening latch, to the effect that it would have caused deep abrasions, maybe even a laceration, as his body passed through the aperture if he dived through.
Thank you. In your report, you consider whether the person in the room in these circumstances could have reached him and stopped him. What was your conclusion?
Yes, I did look at that, particularly because I was considering heights and weights and centers of gravity, etc., and I looked repeatedly at the faint image that we have of the administrative clerk person, Rodriguez, yes, standing at the window, it seemed to me when I visited that the witness Rodriguez is probably very tall, probably about maybe 1.85, maybe even 1.9 meters tall. Placing someone in that position in that office, I believe it's hard to believe, well, I think it's hard to believe that a simple reaching out of that witness wouldn't have been adequate to stop anyone clambering through that window.
And we tend to lead architectural evidence to demonstrate that the width of that room was only 2.8 meters.
Yes, it was 2.6, I think, in my rough estimate, rough measurement, but it could be 2.8, yes.
Now, the version that you have just described now, in relation to the question whether he would have been able to reach the person just before he went out, on what is it based? Did you look at the evidence of Rodriguez?
Just looking at the spatial positioning of the chair in the 2.6 meter wide space. The positioning of the chair, I think it was marked chair A in the diagram, and the aperture window that is just on its right side, if anyone is sitting on it. So I'm just looking at the spatial positioning and distance and the stature of the person that was sitting on that chair with the deceased.
Okay.
Dr. Naidoo, just for the record, you have expressed a view on the actual cause of death, and what was that?
Oh yes, I believe that the cause of death is not as expressed in the transcript blood loss. It was massive head and chest injury, and the possible immediate cause of death was the brain shearing impact. Severe head shearing impact. I don't want to go to the details of why I say that. Find petechial hemorrhages in the brain. They are indication of a high velocity, heavy impact shearing force, and that can cause brainstem damage. And I believe that was probably a great contributor, and of course the severe chest injury.
Is it what the two doctors also found? Or you have a different finding?
No, just a slightly varied. They talk about multiple injuries, and I think they talk about multiple injuries and blood loss and shock, if I'm not mistaken. But it's more the impact, the immediate brain impact, and brain and chest impact. There's minimal blood loss, brain and chest impact that causes death.
You've also expressed a view on whether it was possible for the ante-mortem injuries not to have been detected by those interrogating him or those guarding him.
I just was under the impression that it is so clear on photography, on even the old sepia tone photographs, somewhat vague, fuzzy, that unless he was fully clothed at all times, excluding his hands and his face, it would be hard to understand how these injuries were not evident. If they say in some statements that he slept without a shirt, bare upper chest, upper body, because it was hot, and I would find it hard to reconcile these findings.
And in fact, in diagram E, you do point to some injuries on the hand.
Yes.
Could you explain what those are and indicate whether they would have been visible?
Yes, first of all, in diagram E, you've got an injury, a bruise on the inside, that is the ventral side of the left wrist, and two on the dorsum of the hand, one on the finger, index finger, and the other at the base of the index finger. For one thing is, the hands are what you notice a person by the face and the hands mostly, okay? And you are highly likely to see injuries. And therefore, I find that also hard to reconcile.
And these injuries would have been ante-mortem as opposed to fall-related?
I'm qualifying that answer because there's no measurements and there's no idea of depth, so I don't know how severe those are. And I'm unable to say with confidence, although I'd like to think that they're more likely ante-mortem because they're depicted in about the same frame of mind as Dr. Scaper's depicted the rest. I'd like to think that they're ante-mortem, but I can't be absolutely sure.
Thank you. And then finally, Doctor, you have a heading called Other Incidental Observations, in which you make two observations, one dealing with the fact that the bladder contains a large amount of urine.
Yes.
And then you spoke about contusions on the top of 3 of the left toes. Could you describe to the court why you regard these injuries as significant or interesting for the court?
Well, just to deal with the contusion of the left on the top of the toes, that's the left foot on the top of the middle 3 toes. The contusions are also hard to reconcile with the fall. Secondly, whilst I am similarly, like I wasn't able to say with the greatest amount of confidence about the wounds of the hand and wrist, I'm unable to say clearly that this is ante-mortem. I just wish to raise that because I think on the balance of my opinion it's ante-mortem, its position is troubling because I have done cases inside this country and outside this country of torture, and I have seen wounds in subtle positions like the tops of the toes in such cases.
And if those injuries are not fall-related, how could they have been caused?
I believe strongly we must look at compression of the tops of the toes or the foot, whether the shod foot or unshod foot. We must look at compression of that, blunt force, maybe by tramping, maybe by an instrument.
And the significance of a large amount of urine being in the bladder?
Now, the importance of that is that, well, firstly, he either wasn't taken, or he was refused, or wasn't given a chance. He was in interrogation, a chance to relieve his bladder. That's one thing. For several hours. We don't also know, that's a shortcoming of the autopsy report, we don't know the volume of the urine. How fast do you produce urine? A healthy person, about 100 mils an hour. This is not a person who's probably healthy. I don't know how hydrated he was, but we're looking at many hours then, or at least several hours, in which he hadn't emptied his bladder. But what happens is, we know, and this is why I raise this point, it's a possibility that he was unconscious or in a state of coma, because we see that in comatose people, that there's no conscious effort or unconscious overriding of voluntary control of the controlled bladder, and the bladder stays full and continues to fill up and continues to distend. And that's why we catheterize the bladder to empty it out. So what I'm saying is, consider that either from the restraining context that he wasn't allowed to void his bladder, or that he might have been in a state of coma or unconsciousness.
So even in the state of coma, there wouldn't be a certain release of that bladder?
No, not automatic release from the bladder, no, definitely. We see it all the time. Even after death, the bladder can stay full.
Thank you, Doctor. No further questions, Your Lordship.
Yes.
Thank you, my lord. There's just another theory that I would like to discuss with you, doctor, and that's the significant findings that you find, the swelling of the ankle and the lower limbs. 3 times you said there has been reference to the serious injury to the ankle and the swelling.
Yes.
The theory that I just want to discuss with you, if there was wrestling at the window itself, some people trying to hold on to the leg of Ahmed Timol and fighting on the ledge of that window, could that have caused such injuries that we've seen here? And is it consistent that it's ante-mortem?
It's a fair question. And that's why my criticism of the report is that it doesn't give you an amount to, doesn't give you some sort of quantification of that bleeding. But the description is so extensive and so strikingly obvious as compared to the others that I believe it was there for hours, several hours, before death, and not just before the fall.
Not just.
Yes.
Also, when you gave evidence, you said it's the little things. He was alive once the impact, and it's the little things that, little findings that you made that made you make the deduction that he was alive when.
Yes.
What is the little things that you looked at? What is it? Blood at some of the.
Yes, thank you. I've listed number 25, and it's hemorrhages around the skull and brain, especially at the base that follow the fracture pattern. And I mentioned that the fracture pattern is definitely that of a fall. And the hemorrhage that follows the fracture pattern and the chair, that tells you that he was alive. Then, very importantly, in the frontal white matter, multiple fine pinpoint hemorrhages. That's primary impact injury, what we call primary impact injury. The shearing of fine vessels, like the shearing also of neurons, but fine vessels in high velocity impact, where there's brain lag and things are distorted, and but like a pack of cards that you slide over. That's how the brain will shear as well in that high velocity impact. Then there's also internal hemorrhages in the thalamus, basal ganglia, etc. That's very striking. That's also a high velocity shearing injury, what we call diffuse axonal injury, where we can see it, not always. There was hemorrhages around the lacerations of the lungs, small, not much. Hemorrhage around the torn left renal, or was it right renal artery or left renal artery? As I mentioned, where it's a dumbbell effect, the weighty kidneys and that pull apart. And hemorrhage at the posterior mediastinum, that's behind the esophagus, that's very significant. It's critically noted in high falls, where the aorta tears away from the attachment because of that shearing, the force of the gravitational pull. I believe, in fact, the tear of the aorta might have been missed here to give you that hemorrhage. So all those multiple little positions of hemorrhage are telling me it's enough to suggest that he was alive.
If he was slipping in and out of unconsciousness, in a lucidum intervallum, in a moment where he was clear, or in a delirium tremens, could he try to just get away of everything? Is it possible in a state like that?
Not in that. I'm not a psychologist or a neurosurgeon, neurologist, but I certainly don't think he would have been able to form the intent of doing such a desperate act.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Thompson.
Just one question briefly. I believe the court has asked you before the description of the person in the room. You had indicated that you were furnished with a statement by Sergeant Rodriguez.
Yes.
Right. And the statement that you were furnished with, did it consist of 3 pages, typed in Afrikaans?
Yes. I haven't got it with me, but yes, it was 3 pages, faded, typed old notes in Afrikaans.
Yes, and from the statement that I have, position which I believe Oliver said. It starts at paragraph 1 and gets to paragraph 10. And then the next paragraph you see is paragraph 16.
That may be right, yes. That may
But
be.
there was a few paragraphs.
I think that is correct, yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, my Lord. Doctor, I see in your report on page 16 of your report, in fact, it is the cause of death as indicated by Dr. Skeepers as being multiple injuries.
Yes.
So that is his cause of death.
Yes, but I think in the transcript,
Yes.
I clarified and elaborated further to say it was, I can't remember what it was, but there was something about blood loss.
Doctor, it is correct, and that's also how you recall the transcripts, is that Dr. Gluckman was present with Dr. Skeepers in performing the post-mortem.
Yes.
And Dr. Gluckman was there on the instructions of the family.
That's right.
Yes. Now, in your, and let me rephrase, you do not have Dr. Gluckman's report, or you did not see the Dr. Gluckman's report?
I have not seen it.
Neither have I. I don't think it's before the court. But in his evidence, when he testified, and he testified quite extensively, was there any indication that you could pick up in his evidence where he identified these aspects which are not reconcilable with injuries from a fall?
No, that's a good point, and I looked as far as I could within the Afrikaans and English, looked extensively, and I couldn't pick up anything that wasn't related to the histology microscopic examination that they were doing. So, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing in the transcript that really deals with the reconcilability of wounds between falls and any other things.
And would you agree with me that both Dr. Skeepers and Dr. Gluckman would have been in a better position to identify the wounds and the injuries as well as the possible causes and make a better inference from their observations than you are currently in a position to do?
But that's always the situation with an external expert. It's the prevailing situation always.
No, I understand that. It's not criticism, Doctor. I'm just putting to you, and you would have been in a much better position if you were actually there. And even if the photographs were better, and even if there were X-rays.
Yes.
So all these issues that you have listed as what you would have liked to see in the report would all have put you in a better position to have made a more objective and a more clear finding or an opinion with regard to the injuries.
Well, what it would have done, it would have thrown further light on it, and those, I'm just clarifying the answer, it would have thrown further light onto newer and further aspects, but those things that I've expressed with confidence remain expressed with confidence, even on the basis of the shortcomings of the original report.
Is it objective? Is your opinion objective?
Yes, sir, certainly so.
One of the issues that I pick up in the report of Dr. Skeepers, where he lists the obvious or the clear injuries, is that I do not, in that 35 injuries that you've also tabulated,
yes,
I don't see that he there refers to the depressed skull injury.
Unless in Dr. Glassman's testimony, which was in English, I don't see it referred to it, unless it was referred to in Dr. Cox or Dr. Skeepers' Afrikaans testimony. I have no idea.
Yes, and I'm referring actually to his report.
Yes.
Where he also tabulated his findings that 35 injuries which he noted, and he does note the depressed skull injury in Annexure 2, where he deals with that in the last sentence, and that is why I asked, because certainly you rely in a certain sense to the nuances of the report, but it is almost, and correct me if I'm wrong, in paragraph 5 on page 22 of your report, in the last sentence of that paragraph, it's almost mentioned in passing there that there is a depressed fracture of the left peroneal bone, a small loose fragment of the left peroneal bone is present. Now that by itself, it doesn't give at all a measurement of or a depth of this depressed skull injury, nor of the seriousness of this depressed skull injury.
Correct, yes.
How are we to know how serious it was? Because the way you depict it, and I appreciate your depiction on page 31 on the schematic of the depressed skull injury. There's no really a way from the report and the evidence itself to know how big it was, how thick, how deep it was, or how serious this depressed skull injury was.
I think I can understand your question. I'm going to rephrase it, just your question, and before I answer it, is that if it was, for example, mentioned in passing in paragraphs 5 at the last sentence, and not picked up in one of the number 1 to 35 of the words, is that...
What I'm saying, is that not the indication that it was for him almost an insignificant injury?
Oh, not necessarily so, because remember that the encircling major skull fracture with what I thought were loose fragments was also not seen externally. So, and we know that depressed fractures are invariably, unless you see the bruise, and remember with the hair you may not see it externally, it's usually only seen when lifting the skull and opening the scalp and dissecting off the scalp and then looking at the skull.
And further, if I look at just on that second page, on page 32, when you indicate the injuries to the brain itself, it does not appear, and please correct me if I'm wrong, whether that depressed skull fracture, whether it transferred to the brain.
Correct. It's a very good observation, and I also made that, so I couldn't understand why, and that's a very good observation from a pathological point of view, that if there was a depressed fracture of the skull, that it didn't translate also into underlying visible bruise of the brain. I have no explanation for that.
And just then to come back to what I've earlier said, is that not an indication that the depressed skull fracture that was referred to by Dr. Skeppers is in fact was not of significance for him? And I don't say thereby it's not of significance to the court or what, but was it not for him an incidental issue?
Well, it could maybe for Dr. Skeppers have been incidental or of lesser significance because he's seeing such major other findings to the court. But clinically, a depressed fracture is a depressed fracture. It's an indication of a very severe impact. So the effects on the brain, as I was doing on, do you call it evidence in chief? I don't know, the first part. I was explaining the effects on the brain and function would be just as significant. It may have been, forgive me, it may have been not of great consequence to the documenting pathologists at the time, but clinically it is.
Yes, and certainly, sir. I don't belittle the injury, please don't understand it like that. I'm just trying to understand the severity thereof.
Okay.
And then, Doctor, if I look at we've been supplied with the record of the inquest and the annexures thereto, in which also obviously these photographs or the depictions of the photographs were of the office and the person standing to which you also refer to. And if I look at page 68 of that bundle, Lord, I'm not sure what the bundle's number is. I was not here when it was handed in. Volume B, Lord, and that is volume B, and I'm referring here to page 68 of volume B.
Well, make reference to the alphabets that are sort of marking the pages.
Yes.
BB, yes.
BB,
okay.
Bravo.
Yes, you say page?
I see that loosely, there's a page 68 in it, Exhibit BB.
68.
Yes. This is a statement by Johannes Frederik Koenraad Fick. Now, it is a statement in Afrikaans, and it indicates, and it is a statement which was taken from him on the 24th of November 1971. And I will loosely translate it to you if you don't mind. In the second paragraph, he said that he was assisting with the investigation of the matter on the 28th of October 1971 with then Warrant Officer Daisel showed him the scene, and he found a shrub of 7 foot high, which on the one side was stripped of bark, and on the same side it was burst open. My English is not that well. I also saw various loose branches that was torn off from the tree or from the shrub which he picked up. Now, it seems to me that, as I understand the record and the documents that I've read, as if it was indicated that he fell on the shrub when he fell in the garden. And a 7 foot shrub is quite a significant shrub. It is not a minor, a small something, and there's a bark that's referred to, there's branches that were torn off. Now, when he fell onto such an item, or such a tree, for whatever is a better word, would that have caused some of the injuries? And can that explain some of the injuries? And I'm not referring to the injuries where there was already scab form, which are clearly older injuries. But some of these injuries, for example, under the arm, to the leg, to the ankle, can some of those injuries not be explained by the hitting of this shrub?
A very good question. Sorry. I must just qualify that by saying that what I would have expected if in the terminal stages, the last few meters, 2 meters,
yes,
3 meters, 7 feet of his fall, if he brushed against the shrub, what I'm expecting to find are linear scarification abrasions or impalements. Now, if he wasn't impaled by a branch to cause a puncture wound, I'd expect his skin to have linear frictional abrasions, types of injuries. And we're not seeing that. And I'm not too sure whether it's the foliage, very loose palm-type foliage that I was thinking about, or that's present at the moment there. There's a long palm-type tree that wouldn't cause too significant abrasions. We also don't know what sort of clothing it was, because there is some protective effect that clothing lend to milder impacts like this.
Doctor, there is a photograph or a dated photograph at A5 on that bundle, but I don't think one can make any reference there as to what the structure of the shrub was.
A5.
It's A5. It seems to be on page 65. A5. I also don't know whether this photograph is necessarily of the tree that is referred to. I just see the photograph of the tree here, but I can't use that as significance in my line of questioning. Doctor, then the final issue is if a person falls, as you have described, on his the right side from the head onwards, and the body comes afterwards, is there not a type of a whiplash effect with regard to the legs, which might come down on a very whip-like fashion?
We call it a secondary impact.
Yes.
Primary, and the body falls behind it, the secondary impact, that is possible. And that's what I also alluded earlier.
Yes, but that whip-like or that that coming down of the limbs following on that secondary, would that not have explained the right calf and that injury to that calf?
Not with the bruising, not to the extent and the degree of bruising.
And obviously without the proper testing, which and we don't know with regard to x-rays or the depth of that, because it was not measured, one do not know, apart from the fact that it has been described of extensive bruising, one do not know the full extent of that bruising, how deep
Well,
it is.
one can gauge from the description, and then he describes contused muscle. And if you looked at, I think it's wound, if you looked at the diagram, my diagram C, at the back of the right knee and calf, it talks about contused muscle. Now, if he dissected, he would have seen contused muscle. Now, that would be significant. But if he didn't dissect, so what was he seeing? He was obviously seeing this bluish red, purplish area of bruising to call it contused muscle. He's got to be seeing something to describe it as such.
It's just difficult not knowing what he saw.
Yes, I'm just talking about the relative intensity of the description.
And the photographs, it's of actually, it's not that much of a help if one look at C7, because of the fact, for example, that it doesn't show you the crisp lines, it doesn't show the color of the wounds and the injuries.
Sure.
That does have its limitations. I don't say it's
does.
of no help, but it does have a limitation in assessing the wounds or the injuries, that specific injuries that one refers to.
Yes, the photographs are valuable, but certainly not as specific. And it does miss out that our lower limbs.
Yes.
You can't see the lower limbs.
Yes, no, I saw that as well. Doctor, the issue that Mr. Timol was unconscious when he left the window, there's no clear evidence of that.
We can't say.
We can't say that.
We can't prove that from the pathology,
No.
except that we can suggest that
Yes.
from, if we cannot explain injuries from the fall, we can suggest that there is a high possibility, but we can't confirm it.
Yes, we can't confirm that. And similarly, as to the cause of injuries, the blunt force injuries, as to the instrument or the way in which it was applied to the body, it is also it's near impossible to give a clear indication of that.
Correct.
And likewise also the injuries on the top of the toes, whether or not that was, for example, injuries caused by torture or by some other form of mechanism. It is a possibility, but it is not the exclusive possibility as to the cause of those injuries.
Yes, I think the most important point is that it's not reconcilable with the fall, with the fall alone.
And then one final question, no, thank you. It is, if you've been to, as recently as yesterday, and you looked at the building, you looked at the area from the office there, what would, if you look at a trajectory from a person falling from the window, are there ledges that stands out from the building on which one can also perhaps bump your head or bump some, perhaps the back of your head or anything like that, as he might have tumbled or not tumbled?
I must admit that I did look through the aperture down. Apart from this imposing structure, or I'm not too sure if it's a sun shield or what it was, but it wasn't there. I didn't see anything, but I didn't look specifically. I didn't see any projecting ledges when I looked down. But I didn't specifically look for it.
If there are ledges, and be honest with you, I also don't know whether, I've also only seen the photographs. And if he has tumbled as he fell through the window, and he has bumped his head on those ledges, or any part of his body, would that have explained any of the injuries?
If he fell head first, then he would have gone into a spiral, but in other words, into a spin. So we have to, I don't want to open up something that is relevant, but if he bumps something as an intermediary projecting objective, he would have gone and it would have totally altered his orientation. Generally, when we fall, if you look at a high diver from Olympic into an Olympic pool, you will realize that we can spin. We either spin if we execute a spin to start with, or we can spin at different rates, or if you just fall down feet first, you can fall without spinning. So it's very dynamic.
Why I'm asking this is, could such a spin feature, if he did hit his head on anything or any part of his body, could that not have caused the tumble, which could have caused different injuries on impact, secondary and primary on the ground?
Well, I must say that the presence of an intermediary objective, which will partially arrest his fall, will certainly have changed quite a bit. Yeah.
But you have not considered that?
I've not considered that, nor seen something or presented with any evidence of that, so I haven't considered that.
Thank you, Manolo. I've got no further questions to the witness.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Vani.
Manolo, just one question. My own friend has pointed out that you were not present at the post-mortem, unlike Dr. Skierpers and Dr. Blackman. I think it stands to reason that they have the advantage of identifying the injuries and making their findings. But Dr. Naidoo, once the findings have been made and set out in a post-mortem report, an experienced qualified forensic pathologist, would such a person be in a position to draw competent conclusions and to interpret that report?
Yes, should be. It certainly should have been what a competent other doctor should have been able to do. In fact, it is in fact the ultimate test of the quality of that report, where somebody else can come to the same conclusions. The quality of the documentation. So certainly the report should be, at least at the level of seniority of the autopsy state's doctor, should have been one in which another doctor should have been able to arrive at good conclusions. I'm not sure if I've answered that question appropriately.
Well, the question really is, would an experienced, qualified and experienced forensic pathologist looking at the findings on a post-mortem report, would such a person be able to offer a competent interpretation of those findings?
Of this report?
Yes.
Yes, should be. Well, there are, forgive me, maybe the lateness of the day, but certainly there are shortcomings, lots of shortcomings in this report.
Yes, we're just talking about interpretation of the existing findings.
Oh yes, you can. A competent doctor is able to use a lot of these findings and make good observations, good deductions and inferences from.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Doctor, you mentioned the question of torture that you have examined.
Yes.
When you described the injuries on the toes.
Yes.
Are there other forms of torture that you examined? Say, for example, sleep deprivation.
Not on the deceased, my lord.
Yes.
I referring specifically to the deceased and what we see.
It won't show on the deceased that this person was subjected to hours of
not from an autopsy, but it's only something that a deduction must be made on the basis of all the evidence put together, that if there, for example, something to account for behavior, if you exclude intoxication, if you exclude head injury, if you exclude drug effects, then you have to seriously then consider sleep deprivation. That's how you have arrived at a deduction or an inference from the entire set of findings. So sleep deprivation is not something we could we can make a finding at post-mortem or anyway,
Yes.
but it's a deduction made in consideration of everything, exclusion of all the other causes of similar pathology by the post-mortem and other evidence, and then you come to the diagnosis or finding of sleep deprivation as highly likely as a possibility.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank
As
you.
you said, it's been a long day,
Thank you.
but thank you for your evidence, and I think you've covered this. Mr. Vani, so it's tomorrow 10 o'clock?
Yes, Your Lordship.
Yes.
We will commence with the author, John Vorster, followed by Frank Dutton.
Yes.
And if the court pleases, then we'll hear the application.
Yes. Thank you.
As a court please.
Then we adjourn until tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
All right.
Please, I appreciate because I'm going to consult with it.